The Roman-Latin Wars were a series of wars fought between ancient Rome and the Latins, from the earliest stages of the history of Rome until the final subjugation of the Latins to Rome in the aftermath of the Latin War. First war with Rome. The Latins first went to war with Rome in the 7th century BC during the reign of the Roman king Ancus Marcius. According to Livy, the war was commenced by the Latins, who anticipated Ancus would follow the pious pursuit of peace adopted by his grandfather, Numa Pompilius. The Latins initially made an incursion on Roman lands. When a Roman embassy sought restitution for the damage, the Latins gave a contemptuous reply. Ancus accordingly declared war on the Latins. The declaration is notable since, according to Livy, it was the first time that the Romans had declared war by means of the rights of the Fetials. Ancus Marcius marched from Rome with a newly levied army and took the Latin town of Politorium by storm. Its residents were removed to settle on the Aventine Hill in Rome as new citizens, following the Roman traditions from wars with the Sabines and Albans. When the other Latins subsequently occupied the empty town of Politorium, Ancus took the town again and demolished it. Further citizens were removed to Rome when Ancus conquered the Latin towns of Telene and Ficana. The war then focused on the Latin town of Medullia. The town had a strong garrison and was well fortified. Several engagements took place outside the town and the Romans were eventually victorious. Ancus returned to Rome with much booty. More Latins were brought to Rome as citizens and were settled at the foot of the Aventine near the Palatine Hill, by the Temple of Murcia. War with Rome under Tarquinius Priscus. When Rome was ruled by Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the Latins went to war with Rome on 2 occasions. On the first, which according to the Fasta Triumphales occurred prior to 588 BC, Tarquinius took the Latin town of Appiale by storm, and from there brought back great booty to Rome. On the second occasion, Tarquinius subdued the entirety of Latium, and took a number of towns that belonged to the Latins or which had revolted to them. Corniculum, Old Ficulalia, Camarilla, Crustumerium, Ameriola, Medullia and Nomentum, before agreeing to peace. War between Clusium and Aricia. In 5008 BC, Lars Porsena, king of Clusium, departed Rome after ending his war against Rome by peace treaty. Porsena split his forces, and sent part of the Clusian army with his son Aruns to besiege the Latin city of Aricia. The Aricians sent for assistance from the Latin League, and also from the Greek city of Cumae. When support arrived, the Arician army ventured beyond the walls of the city, and the combined armies met the Clusian forces in battle. According to Livy, the Clusians initially routed the Arician forces, but the Cumaean troops allowed the Clusians to pass by, then attacked from the rear, gaining victory against the Clusians. Livy says the Clusian army was destroyed. The Pometian revolt. In 503 BC, 2 Latin towns, Pometia and Cora, said by Livy to be colonies of Rome, revolted against Rome. They had the assistance of the southern Aurunci tribe. Livy says that a Roman army led by the consuls Agrippa Menenius Lanatus and Publius Postumius Tubertus met the enemy on the frontiers and was victorious. After which Livy says the war was confined to Pometia. Livy says many enemy prisoners were slaughtered by each side. Livy also says that the consuls celebrated a triumph. However, the Fasta Triumphales record that an ovation was celebrated by Postumius and a triumph by Menenius, both over the Sabines. In the following year the consuls were Apita Virginius and Sp. Cassius. Livy says that they attempted to take Pometia by storm, but then resorted to siege engines. However, the Aurunci launched a successful sally, destroying the siege engines, wounding many, and nearly killing one of the consuls. The Romans retreated to Rome, recruited additional troops, and returned to Pometia. They rebuilt the siege engines, and when they were about to take the town, the Pometians surrendered. The Oronzi leaders were beheaded, the Pometians sold into slavery, the town razed and the land sold. Livy says the consuls celebrated a triumph as a result of the victory. The Faster Triumphales record only one triumph, by Cassius, the Battle of Lake Regillus and the Foedus Cassianum. In 501 BC word reached Rome that 30 of the Latin cities had joined in league against Rome, at the instigation of Octavius Mamilius of Tusculum. Because of this, Titus Lartius was appointed as Rome's first dictator, with Spurius Cassius as his magister equitum. However, war with the Latins did not come to pass until at least 2 years later. In 499 BC, or possibly 496 BC, war broke out. At first Phidane was besieged, Crustumerium was captured, and Praeneste defected to the Romans. Aulus Postumius was appointed dictator, with Titus Ebutius Elva as his magister equitum. With the Roman army, they marched into the Latin territory and were victorious at the Battle of Lake Regillus. Shortly afterwards, in 495 BC, the Latins resisted calls from the Volscia to join with them to attack Rome, and went so far as to deliver the Volscian ambassadors to Rome. The Roman Senate, in gratitude, granted freedom to 6,000 Latin prisoners, and in return the Latins sent a crown of gold to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Rome. A great crowd formed, including the freed Latin prisoners, who thanked their captors. Great bonds of friendship were said to have arisen between the Romans and the Latins as a result of this event. The Latins also warned Rome of the Volscian invasion, which occurred shortly after. In the same year, in 493, a treaty, the Foedus Cassianum, was concluded, establishing a mutual military alliance between the Latin cities with Rome as the leading partner. A second people, the Hernici, joined the alliance sometime later. While the precise workings of the Latin League remains uncertain, its overall purpose seems clear. During the 5th century the Latins were threatened by invasion from the Equi and the Volscia, as part of a larger pattern of Sabellian-speaking peoples migrating out of the Apennines and into the plains. Several peripheral Latin communities appear to have been overrun, and the ancient sources record fighting against either the Equi, the Volscia, or both almost every year during the first half 5th century. This annual warfare would have been dominated by raids and counter-raids rather than the pitched battles described by the ancient sources. Defection of the Latins from Rome. In 390 a Gaulish warband first defeated the Roman army at the Battle of Allia and then sacked Rome. According to Livy, the Latins and Hernici, after 100 years of loyal friendship with Rome, used this opportunity to break their treaty with Rome in 389. In his narrative of the years that followed, Livy describes a steady deterioration of relations between Rome and the Latins. In 387 the situation with Latins and Hernici was brought up in the Roman Senate, but the matter was dropped when news reached Rome that Etruria was in arms. In 386 the Antiates invaded the Pontine territory and it was reported in Rome that the Latins had sent warriors to assist them. The Latins claimed they had not sent aid to the Antiates, but had not prohibited individuals from volunteering for such service. A Roman army under Marcus Furius Camillus and P. Valerius Potitus Poplicola met the Antiates at Satricum. In addition to Volscians, the Antiates had brought a large number of Latins and Hernicans to the field. In the battle that followed, the Romans were victorious and the Volscians were slaughtered in great number. The Latins and Hernicans now abandoned the Volscians, and Satricum fell to Camillus. The Romans demanded to know from the Latins and Hernici why for the last few years' wars they had not furnished any contingents. They claimed not to have been able to supply troops due to fear of Volscian incursions. The Roman Senate considered this defense to be insufficient. But that time was not right for war. In 385 the Romans appointed Aulus Cornelius Cossus dictator to deal with the Volscian War. The dictator marched his army into the Pomptine territory, which he had heard was being invaded by the Volscians. The Volscian army was once again swelled by Latins and Hernici, including contingents from the Roman colonies of Circeri and Velytra, and in the battle that followed, the Romans were once again victorious. The majority of the captives are found to be Hernici and Latins, including men of high rank, which the Romans take as proof that their states are formally assisting the Volscians. However, the sedition of Marcus Manlius Capitolinus prevented Rome from declaring war on the Latins. When the Latins, Hernici, and the colonists of Circeri and Velytra tried to persuade the Romans to release those of their countrymen who had been made prisoner, they were refused. That same year Satricum was colonized with 2,000 Roman citizens, each to receive 2.5 jugera of land. Some modern historians have questioned Livy's portrayal of the Latins as rebelling from Rome. Cornell believes that there was no armed uprising of Latins. Rather, the military alliance between Rome and the other Latin towns seems to have been allowed to wither. In the preceding decades, Rome had grown considerably in power, especially with the conquest of Eri, and the Romans might now have preferred freedom of action to the obligations of the alliance. Also, several Latin towns appear to have remained allied to Rome. Based on later events, these would have included at least Tusculum and Lanuvium, to which Cornell adds Aricia, Lavinium and Ardea. The colonies of Circeri and Velytra are likely to have remained partly inhabited by Volscia, which helps explain their rebellion. But these two settlements, more than any other Latin towns, would have felt vulnerable to Rome's aggressive designs for the Pomptine region. Division among the Latins is also the stance taken by Oakley, who substantially accepts Cornell's analysis. The continued loyalty of Ardea, Aricia, Gabii, Labicum, Lanuvium and Lavinium would help explain how Roman armies could operate in the Pomptine region. In their writings on the early Roman Republic, Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus often mention men from states formerly at peace with Rome fighting in the armies of Rome's enemies in a private capacity. Though this might genuinely reflect Italic warfare of this era, Livy appears here to be using it as a literary motif to bring continuity to his narrative of the 380s.